Hello, I'm Laura. Welcome back to my messy sewing room. And instead of cleaning it today, I'm going to talk to you about starting your sewing. I don't mean learning to sew or getting started sewing. I mean literally the first steps when you start to sew a seam. So let's get started. Many sources for teaching to sew or learning to sew with a machine especially start with always having a backstitch at the beginning of any seam. And there's a couple different ways to have a machine do that. On older machines, which is actually the method I prefer, there's a little switch that you just flip. Usually it's your stitch length selector just kind of flips up and then the machine stays in reverse until you flip it back down, which I adore. The newer machines usually do have a button that you have to hold down the whole time you want the machine to run backwards, which takes a little getting used to. It's not horrible, but you know, you can guess which one I prefer. I prefer the old one. Now, some truly vintage machines do not have a back setting at all. They cannot run backwards. So I'm going to show you first of all when I start a seam why you're choosing to go backwards, and also alternatives for if you either don't want to or have a machine that can't. So why do you want to do this? Partly you're securing the seam at the beginning of the seam. If you just start stitching, there's nothing hanging on to those two thread tails at the end, and if you handle the project at all in between sewing sessions or even in the same sewing session, it's very easy to end up with that part of the seam kind of unraveling. And that's a pain because then you either have to stitch it again or, well, then you have to stitch it again. So you don't want to have to do that. And there are moments when you definitely don't want to backstitch, like if you have basting or any other stitching that you're pretty confident you may need to take out, you're better off not doing any backstitching or securing those tails at all. But there are also reasons you don't want to use backstitching as your only method for securing tails. So first of all, some machines just don't have that feature. Very vintage machines don't have that feature. And then some machines do have that feature, but you shouldn't use it because frankly, that is one of the first things to fail on a lot of machines I've seen over the years. The machine either won't go into reverse or it gets stuck in reverse, and either way it's a real hassle. You really have to have the whole thing taken apart and cleaned, and even then it may not always be the most reliable mechanism on that particular machine. So there are lots of good reasons to want different ways to do this besides just doing the backstitch, and I will go over that now. Reason number one, you might not want to backstitch, even if your machine can and will, is that sometimes you just don't like the way it looks. If you're doing top stitching that's very visible along, you know, the top of a seam or the back of a collar, you might decide you just don't like the way it looks. And so, you know, that's fair. It does create a slightly denser line of stitching since you're stitching over the area twice. So, you know, maybe you don't want to do it for that reason. Another reason you might not want to do it is if your fabric is a little finicky. That is usually the moment when it will really cry out in astonishment that you're sewing it, putting two lines of stitching in one spot. Some fabrics just don't like it, so you know, you might maybe want to avoid it for that reason. Those are kind of the two main reasons I can think of besides just machine problems. So yeah, I'll show you how it works, and then I will show you a couple of ways to avoid it. All right, now again, one of the reasons that we need something to secure that stitching is because we can't actually start stitching right at the edge for most fabrics. You want to leave a little space in the front of the work because that helps keep the fabric from basically getting sucked down into the bobbin area of the machine. You also want to hang on to those thread tails for at least the first couple of stitches, unless you have a machine where the bobbin thread is being held for you by the machine. And in this case, I'm just doing the standard straightforward, starting out a couple stitches forward, a couple stitches back, basically as close as I feel safe getting to the edge of the fabric, and then stitching to the end of the seam. And here's a close-up of what that looks like. And this is obviously a heavily contrasting thread, but you can see that at the beginning when I'm backstitching, it is extra thick. There's 2 lines of stitching there, and you can definitely see that. Option 2 starts with me engaging in slightly risky behavior, which is where I am starting the seam much, much closer to the absolute edge than I did the first time, because I'm not planning on backstitching. So I am really trying to gauge exactly how close to this cut edge I can get before I have any problems. Step 2 for this method, besides getting the camera in focus, involves basically pulling gently on the bobbin side of the beginning of the thread. And this is sometimes a little fiddly, and it's worse if you're anxious about your camera going on focus. But basically pulling through so that you have both tails on one side of the fabric. This will usually be easiest from the bobbin side, so pay attention to which side was down when you were sewing. And you can simply tie a knot here. If you want more security than a simple knot can provide, you can tie a knot and then add a little dot of fray check, which will help hold the knot and hold this seam from unraveling. Option 3 starts out a little funny, but stay with me. Basically, that I'm showing you first, that was the line of stitching I want to go, that's the direction of stitching. But I'm going to start out at a 90-degree angle to that stitching. And again, I'm just as close to the edge as I feel comfortable. I'm stitching forward. I can then, with the needle down, lift the foot, rotate the work, and then start sewing. Now there is a little finesse to this technique. Having that 90-degree angle does help hold the threads pretty securely. But if you look closely, or even if you don't look closely, you might notice that my stitching at the beginning of the seam was not the correct seam allowance. So I actually went a little too far into the fabric before I turned, and I'm going to show you a tip for avoiding that. So down here at the bottom of the seam we have that's where I wanted to be. Up here at the top it's too far in. So how to avoid that? Well, you avoid that by marking how deep you want that seam to be. This is a 5/8 inch seam. I'm taking a piece of 1/2 inch wide tape. It can be masking tape. This happens to be 3M micropore tape, which I just always have in the sewing room. And basically I know that as long as I don't stitch too far past that edge of that tape, I'm going to be good to go on my seam allowance. So I'm lining up. And the nice thing about the tape too is it does provide a little extra stiffness to the fabric, so it can help prevent the fabric from getting pulled into the machine as well. So it can kind of make you feel safer working closer to the edge. Though I was checking that distance and I found it wasn't quite far enough, so then I took a couple stitches more. Again, rotated with the needle down, and now I'm ready to sew. Now just in case you're thinking, oh gosh, what do I do about that tape? It does pick off actually very easily. It's part of why I like 3M, and even where you've stitched through it, that should just come right off. You may have to pick at it a little bit, but it is generally pretty clean. And you can see, even though the very edge there that is not secured is loose, the corner that I sewed through is definitely staying put. Last but not least, you can also start your seam by setting your stitch length to 0, taking 2 or 3 stitches, and then moving it back to your normal setting and going from there. And where that happens depends on your machine. Sometimes the stitch selection for length is on the side, sometimes it's on the top, sometimes it's a lever. It's just one of those things. It really depends on the machine. If this is your first time coming by today, thank you for coming. If you're coming back, thank you for coming back. Either way, hope to see you soon.